Good afternoon, welcome to Black Hat. This is the Threat Intelligence track. This is Datagram, and he will be presenting on tamper-evident devices. David?
Thank you. Is this on yet? Turn on? All right. Oh, now it's on. Okay, welcome. This is tamper-evident devices. My name is Datagram. I'm a general douche. I work with tamper-evident technologies, non-destructive entry, a whole lot of lock-picking is essentially what that means, safe cracking as well. I'm also heavily interested in forensics, particularly forensic locksmithing, which is determining if anything other than a key has been used inside or to open a lock. I also do computer security, like all of you, so general bullshit term there too. And I run a couple of lock-related websites, and hopefully eventually I'll have enough free time to make a tamper-related website with much of the same information. So, we all work in security, fortunately, unfortunately, and there's a whole lot of snake oil. So we have all these terms, we have a lot of acronyms, a lot of things that don't really mean anything to us as security professionals. So there's three terms that are important for this talk. So tamper-resistant, tamper-proof, and tamper-evident. So what's the difference between these three? A product that's tamper-resistant actively tries to prevent or deter tampering. Something that's tamper-proof is mythological. That would imply that you cannot tamper with it in any way. So in the same sense, we say a lock is pick-proof or software is hack-proof. There's lots of things that say they are tamper-proof. And what tampering means is also a gray area. And then there's things that are tamper-evident. And so they're not necessarily tamper-resistant, and they're certainly not tamper-proof, but they're meant to leave evidence of tampering. So the general definition of something that's tamper-evident is anything that leaves evidence of access, alteration, modification, replacement, anything that's not normal. Now you're thinking, well, a lot of stuff could be tamper-evident. The mail we get, the basic, lick and seal envelopes, those are technically tamper-evident, right? To a degree, but there's a lot of things that are represented specifically to enhance your tampered evidence. Now you might say, why don't we just use locks? Why not just put a lock on there? A lock is technically supposed to be tamper-resistant, right? And some locks are also tamper-evident. But think of lock picking. How many of you have picked a lock in this room? See? You guys are awesome. How easy was it? Easy? Hard? Were you surprised that you could pick a lock so quickly with such little skills and a limited toolkit?
Depends on the lock.
Well, of course it depends on the lock. But all the locks we picked to start, well, we live in America where we all use shit locks to begin with. So they're all very easy for the most part. So why don't we just use locks? Why don't we lock up whatever we don't want accessed or altered or replaced? Locks are expensive, very expensive. Locks usually come with keys, and then you have the whole problem of key management and key distribution and all that sort of stuff. We also have to consider, are we trying to prevent access or detect it? Because sometimes one is more important than the other. And then you also have to consider that locks need to function. Tamper-evident devices generally are one-way locks. They have no keys. They just lock up, and the only thing that they're supposed to do is leave evidence of them being unlocked. And one other thing is that tampered devices force you to inspect them. If you have a padlock on your gate, you have your key, you go, the key works, and it opens, you really have no reason to take that lock apart and look for any evidence of lockpicking or key bumping or any of these other attacks that we usually talk about in these conferences. But with tamper-evident devices, you're meant to inspect them. That's their only reason for existing. So who uses this? Excuse me? Everyone, all of you right now, has bought, has on you, or has at home a tamper-evident device. Some are there because they're required to be there by law. Some are there because people want them to be there so that you have confidence when you buy their product. And lots of other reasons. So food and drug packaging, all the medicine bottles you buy, all the food you buy. Quality assurance, saying that this has gone through inspection, so it should meet factory specs. Warranty fraud protection. So everyone, how many of you own some sort of gaming console, a TV, a DVD player? Everybody, right? How many of you own a phone? All of those probably have little tamper-evident seals on them to to ensure that you're not voiding your warranty, and to generally cover other people's asses. There's also transportation security. You know, you think, okay, I have my iPhone. Those have little seals. When they get shipped to whoever sells the iPhone, I don't have an iPhone. I don't know who sells and buys iPhones. But you'll come to find during the course of this talk that I'm kind of a giant noob. So you can do 10 times better at all this than me. But think of, you know, from the manufacturer to the end user, how all those goods get shipped and stored and transported. All those use tamper devices in some form or another. And we're not talking about, you know, a big crate that has a tilt sensor or a water sensor. Those are generally damage detectors. They also have tamper-evident qualities. You know, if you consider used water to open a crate, or you tilted it and shook it to do whatever, they have some, they leave some evidence, but they're not specifically designed for that, per se. There's also this idea of confidentiality, information assurance. How many of you ever mailed a letter that has something important? How many of you have ever, well, in the same sense, sent an email that has a password in it? Think of it the same, but the physical side of things. So tamper devices are used to seal all those. And beyond that, intelligence agencies and governments are very, very dependent on tamper-evident devices. Customs and Border Patrol need all cargo to be sealed with some sort of tamper-evident device. We use them for nuclear safeguards, for transporting hazardous materials across the country, internationally. And we also use them for treaty enforcement between different countries. So think United Nations, IAEA are responsible for doing the tamper-evident seals for North Korea and so on. And that's so that when two countries agree, say, hey, let's stop making bombs, you know, it's hard to say, oh, okay, and then we don't just say, oh, well, they agreed, so that's good. We put seals on them so that we have inspectors go inspect the seals and make sure that both sides are honoring their agreements. So we're going to go over a brief history of tampering, because it actually has a pretty rich history. And then we're going to talk about two main types of tamper seals. And we have a bunch of demos. There's been 2 talks in the last 2 years that relate to tamper stuff. One, unfortunately, was given by some government people, so they were literally not allowed to discuss any vulnerability information. That changes today. And the other one was given by some friends of mine, and they didn't have time to demo. So both things are changed today. And hopefully we won't run out of time. So what we used to use a long time ago, the first kind of ideas we had for this were, you know, putting clay over something. Let's say we have a box. We'll seal it in clay and, you know, send it to person B. When they get it, they can look at the clay and look and see if it's been cracked. You know, the same way that if you go buy a steak, you look at all the plastic wrap on the steak to make sure it's not broken. And you can get some very complicated seals with this. You know, this is essentially an early version of a wax seal. And here's a similar thing, where if you have a rope securing something, you put a clay seal around the rope and then put some stamps into it. So when the person gets it at the other end, they should see that all these are intact and that it has not been tampered with. The Pope, I actually think this is a very cool story. The Pope has a ring, a little papal ring, and he uses it to stamp wax seals on cool documents. There's a person responsible for melting down an outgoing Pope's ring and making the next Pope a new ring. So they have a pretty sophisticated tamper control with the Pope. This is from mid-1800s. We started combining locks and tamper seals. And if you see these you know, out in the wild, oh, speaking of in the wild, we have a Caesar's Palace fire extinguisher with a tamper seal on it, which might come in handy in case we start a fire, which we'll talk about flammable stuff later. But anyways, they were mad that I took that, but that's okay. There is flammable stuff, so we're good. They started combining these stamps, and there's also some that have glass plates with locks. And you can see on the bottom here, there's a little hasp, and that covers the keyhole so that dirt and stuff doesn't get into it. Because, you know, again, locks are very sensitive mechanisms in some cases. So they open this up, they lock the lock, and then they put the stamp over the keyhole. So the next time somebody goes to unlock the lock, they can inspect this stamp to see if it, you know, obviously if there's a big hole poked in it. During World War I, World War II, Vietnam, basically every war since the Civil War, we've done mail censorship here and there. And so have a lot of other countries. And so you could see on the left, we use a tape to say, you know, okay, this has gone through postal censorship, but then we also use an ink stamp. Oh, Sorry? And then if you look up at the top left, you'll see they even wrote the language that the inside document was written in. And on top of that, for all of our mail, we use stamps to say that they've gone through the mail system. During the Cold War, the beginnings of the Cold War, beginnings of the CIA, they had a lot of difficulty getting agents into Moscow and getting information back from those agents. So what the CIA did is they did this very thorough program where they sent hundreds or thousands of postcards. And they'd pick different postcards, they'd send them to different addresses to different people from different people, different messages to the recipient, and so on and so forth. And they'd try and hide on some of these secret ink. And then when they got to their destination, they'd examine them thoroughly, very, very thoroughly, to detect, A, if there was tampering, B, what methods of tampering that the Russians might be using, and C, what letters have not been tampered with, and then identify characteristics of those to try and, to get them through censorship. Because you can imagine all the mail, even back then, you can't censor every single piece of mail going through your country. It's just not feasible. So they try and identify, say, if we do this, if we use this postcard, if we send it to this part of the world, it may not be censored. And therefore, we could put secret ink on it and be more ensured that it has not or will not be tampered with. During the 1980s, there was a big scare in Chicago where people started dying from taking Tylenol. And they found out that some of the pills had been replaced with cyanide instead of Tylenol. And I think 4 or 5 people died, and to this day, they don't know how it happened. And Johnson & Johnson, then I think still owner of Tylenol, said, as far as the factory is concerned, we can't detect tampering. They seem fine after they left the factory. But they still frantically pulled them off the shelves of Chicago. And after all this kind of went down, we developed a Federal Anti-Tampering Act, I believe of 1982, might be 1981. And that led us to modern-day seals, where now all pharmaceuticals are required to have these multi-layers of seals to get to the actual medicine. So if you think of your typical medicine bottle, we have to open the box. We have to take the plastic wrap off the container. Some of them have apparently child-proof, but sometimes adult-proof lid to take off. And then below that is a combination wax and adhesive seal covering the actual pills. Again, talking about how many of you own Xboxes. Previously, Microsoft used a warranty sticker that would seal up the case that you would theoretically have to remove the warranty sticker, and then it would show a residue saying it's void on their Xboxes. And so people started making YouTube videos of them removing the warranty sticker and then opening it up and then modding their Xbox and so on and so forth. So Microsoft was like, well, we're very proud of our product, but we're going to introduce a new seal. So now there's videos of this seal on YouTube being removed with a hairdryer and wax paper. So it's cover your ass territory, and it's not very secure in the sense of leaving evidence of tampering. We use these a lot for evidence handling and cash deposit transfers, and even, I learned this recently, duty-free bags, you can store certain so-called dangerous materials, chemicals particularly, you think aerosol cans and nail polish remover and that kind of stuff. As long as you get there with the sealed duty-free bag, then it's okay to take on the plane. So think of the implications of that if you were able to tamper those properly. And again, it depends a lot on, of course, the airport and if you're going through customs and where you're going and who you are sometimes, of whether or not they're going to inspect this very thoroughly. But you can imagine if you have a sealed duty-free bag, you're probably going to be okay for whatever you're transporting. I just said we use these a lot in evidence handling, so sealing evidence bags. This is obviously just a manila envelope, but we also have dedicated evidence bags that look a lot like the cash deposit bags that we talked about. And it's just a basic adhesive seal, for the most part. We use these a lot in electronics now, and this is where it kind of borders on tamper resistance, because the goal of a lot of these things is to prevent reverse engineering and a lot of the hardware and software level attacks that all the rest of Black Hat talks about. So here's an example of a Motorola chip, and the leads are all covered in epoxy. So it makes it very difficult to remove the chip or have access to the leads. And then if you were to gain access, it should presumably be evident that you did so, because you'd have to remove the epoxy, and then it may or may not be very difficult to reapply it properly. And if you want to get even crazier, you can coat your whole chips in epoxy, and then you can't even see what's on it. And so this is more of a government level thing where they want their crypto chips, or for commercial purposes, a lot of DRM chips will just be completely covered in this stuff. So it still works electronically, of course, but it's much more difficult to reverse engineer. And it also should, again, theoretically leave evidence when you try and get rid of this stuff, because it's very hard to reapply. Talking about phones, all of your phones probably use a water sensor, and if you take off the case, you'll probably see a bunch of adhesive seals over all the little bolts that are necessary to take it completely apart. So those are used, again, for warranty protection to determine if you've taken your product apart. How many of you, well, you don't have to raise your hand, I suppose, but how many of you have to take a piss test for work? Well, those also have little tamper seals on them, and so do things we use to store blood when it's getting transported from your arm to wherever blood goes in the hospital, and also on a lot of other medicine balls and dangerous chemicals in hospitals. How many of you have power? So everybody, mostly. All of your little power meters use some kind of tamper seal on them to determine if you're tampering with your meter. This is one of the, it's called a bolt seal, and this is used for cargo transportation a lot. If you drove to or from Black Hat or DEF CON, take a look at all the big rigs when you're stuck in traffic wondering why they chose to put 10,000 people in one city for the weekend. And you'll find a lot of these things on the back of trucks, and it'll probably be combined with padlocks in most cases. And they're just these little one-way locks that snap together and are very difficult to remove by hand or with machines. One thing that I might not have pointed out is none of these prevent theft. That's not their goal, only to evidence theft. So the actual removal method for this seal, when it gets, the truck gets to its destination, is to cut it off with bolt cutters. Of course, after you've inspected it and made sure that it does not indicate tampering. But all of these can be ripped off or removed very easily physically. The IAEA does treaty enforcement with North Korea, and they use this thing, it's called a cup seal, and it's a two-part thing that snaps together similar to the bolt seal. And the holes are so you could thread a wire through it, and then you could secure whatever you have. They take it to the next level, and they put these scratches here and little dabs of solder, so that even if it were replaced, it would be evident that it was replaced or tampered with. So, when they install this, they do all this to the one half of it, they take a photo of it, and then they snap it together. The next time they do their inspection, they inspect the outside, of course, they cut it off, whatever they're going to look at, and then they cut it in half and look at this to make sure that this pattern is the same. This is a picture of Marines sealing a container of nuclear material, and if you notice, the seal that they're using is the exact same seal that was used in the photo of the man holding up the evidence bag. It's just a simple little sticker, basically. So, as with most security products, there's a lot of strange representations of how these things are supposed to function. Is anybody in this room uncomfortable removing a zip tie without damaging it? Ha ha ha, right? I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding whatsoever. I found it hilarious that zip ties are sold as tamper-proof, almost universally. Now, maybe they don't mean that. Maybe they mean, well, once you store it on something, it shouldn't come apart easily. But they do use the word tamper-proof, which I find interesting. So let's use a different example. What about actual tamper companies? Tamper-evident labels, in this case, an adhesive. So it says, impossible to reseal or reuse. We'll talk about mechanical seals, one of these little guys, and it says positively tamper-proof, and you'll laugh at that in a moment. So, what makes something tamper-evident? It's durable for whatever it needs to be durable for, but it's weak. It does not resist physical manipulation or removal. They're generally one-way lock mechanisms. Tamper-evident devices should not be resealable, because then essentially they become a lock, which can be opened and closed surreptitiously. They usually have unique identifiers. Most of these here have a serial number, so that if you were just to try and replace it, that would be obvious, when the person comes to inspect it. Our friend the fire extinguisher does not have a serial number. But again, it's just a fire extinguisher. Most of these are very sensitive to almost anything. So when you have a tamper seal, This is a cable seal we'll talk about in a minute. Oh, something stuck. Ah, there we go. So it's just this little wire. And so, see, I pull it to make sure it's closed, right? So that's called the tug test. You tug it, make sure you feel. Some have a little bit of play, so you can incorporate that into your inspection to see, if it doesn't have play, that means it may have been tampered with. But these are all very, very weak to everything you can imagine. So how do we inspect these? Because, again, when we defeat these technologies, we usually defeat the person. It requires somebody to inspect it, to actually look and detect tampering. And again, better devices should make tampering more evident. It should be easier to spot. But that makes us lazy, usually. So again, we could just look at it. You see this is on here. Or our friend here, I'll just leave him up here. And we see, OK, that looks fine. Passes the tug test. Somebody just said, that's what she said. Thank you. You can also inspect it very closely, see if there's any little tool marks, any parts missing, anything melted, anything damaged, discolored. You can also disassemble it. We can cut this seal apart. We'll use this one since it's basically the same thing. We could cut this seal apart and look at if there's any inside pieces and see if they have tool marks or damage or have been replaced. And then you can get really hardcore about it, but nobody does. Governments and intelligence agencies do. Nobody else does because nobody has the resources or the time or, frankly, the patience. And then you can also think you can incorporate traps and alarms to make tamper evidence more easy to spot. So you think of the department store with all their little ink things. So if you walk out, it sprays ink everywhere. That's considered a trap. In the same sense, if you walk out and it has the little tag on it that starts the machines all beeping and all the security guards tackle you, that's considered an alarm. So what does defeating a tamper seal mean? So tampering, again, is a gray term that's hard to define. Is removing it tampering? Is cutting it open tampering? Is replacing it tampering? The answer is yes for probably everything you could think of, if you can think of a definition for tampering. And a true tamper-evident seal should attempt to defend against as many things as possible. But as far as defeating it, just tearing it off doesn't count as a defeat, because that leaves evidence. So when we defeat a tamper seal, we either make it so that we open it and close it without the inspector being able to identify it, or we replace it without them being able to identify it. Because if you replace it, you could just rip off what's there and put a new one on. But again, it has to have all these same characteristics, has to have the play, has to have the serial number, all the markings, color, all that sort of stuff. Any questions up to this point? We'll talk about actual seals soon. So there's essentially vulnerabilities in every stage of the design up to you actually tearing off a tamper seal as part of your actual process. So there's problems with design, problems that the end user can't really fix. There's problems with procurement. Think of if you set up a fake tamper company and sell them flawed seals that are easier to defeat in some way, but they pass all this normal tug test examination stuff. Think of how you store it. What if seals are tampered with before they're actually put in use? Think of installation. Could there be problems with installation? Some of these devices aren't straightforward to install, with the exception of probably the bolt seal, which just bolts together. What about inspection? Inspection is probably the biggest area of attack because the level of defeat you require is only as good as the inspector that's going to actually look at the tamper seal at the end of the day. And then there's also problems with removal and disposal. Around where I'm from, the gas and power people just tear off the old ones whenever they need to and throw it next to them. So I have a big pile of power company seals, which could probably be modified to make counterfeits. So the first thing we're going to talk about is mechanical seals. And these are seals that mechanically lock, quote unquote, lock something, right? They're physical barriers to whatever you're trying to get into. So in most of these cases, think of a hasp, right? And normally we would put a padlock on it. But think of what the difference is if we put a tamper seal on it. So zip ties, seriously, zip ties, not a joke. So show of hands, how many of you, if I gave you a zip tie, can open it? Okay, keep your hands up. How many of you think you would still be able to open it if I pulled it tight? Right? Okay, well, let's look at our first actual seal. This is called a beaded cable seal. And it's just this little beaded leg, and it goes through the body. And once it goes through the body, you're not supposed to be able to pull it out. So guess what it is? A zip tie. A three-sided zip tie, essentially, is what this is, right? And this talk isn't really about naming manufacturers and saying people are liable. It's just about what tamper seals are and why some of them are flawed and what we can do to improve them. So this is a zip tie. How many of you think you could open this? Ah, not as confident now. So the first thing we can do is we can simply shim it. And we can do this with zip ties too. So I already have the shim sort of inserted. You can see it passes the tug test. Come here. In the red. Come here. So just lightly tug on it or you break it. Just make sure it's sealed. You sealed? Give them a thumbs up if it's sealed. Okay. Okay, so I've inserted a high-tech Coke can. And I've just rolled it up and got it around the cable. And I'm just going to push it through while pushing the cable through. And if I'm not a retard, you can open it. Right? Thank you for that one laugh, or one clap, sir. That guy was like, man, nobody else clapped. So that's it. And then if you want, you could pass this one around. And you can look at it. And I was playing with it before, so there might be little scrape marks, but for the most part, it's very difficult to tell. And there's tons of these. This is essentially the theme for half of the products most manufacturers make, is this basic zip tie idea of we have a little piece that goes in and you're not supposed to come out. Essentially a zip tie. Now they're serialized zip ties, to their credit, but they're all very easy to defeat. The next seal we're going to talk about is called a plunger seal. Just a note on naming. These are my names for them because every company picks retarded names for them, like truck seal. So there's 50 things that are truck seal that are all different. So I'm calling it what it looks like. So those are beaded cable seals, or just fancy zip ties is one of my preferred terms. This is called the plunger seal. And so it's a fixed length, obviously serialized little piece of plastic, right? And it just clips into the other end, and you're not supposed to be able to open it. So the internals look something like this. It's sort of like a zip tie, but instead of our normal, what we're used to, they close off one end, they cap it, right? So this plunger just goes in and snaps in behind those little teeth, and then they designed the plunger itself to be more, I'm pointing here like you guys can see it, but I'm sorry. They design it so that it's hard to get your little shim material into there because you have to go through two 90-degree bends. And but they cap it on most of these. So what's the obvious method of attack? Decap it, right? So oh, and I totally forgot to mention my notes. The other qualification I have is I'm the leader of the Motherfucking Professionals, which is the team that won the Tamper contest last year at DEF CON. And will win this year. So we have a very extensive counterfeit part collection. So think, you don't need to counterfeit the entire seal, you just need to counterfeit the parts that allow you access to open it. So we have a giant box of different color caps that we've pulled from other seals. And these are, just think if you buy, 10 of each color, you just sit there with an X-Acto knife, you could cut each of these caps out. There's other techniques to remove them, but we don't really have time for that. But just look. And also inside, we also have replacement little detainers. So in case we mar them up with an X-Acto knife or something that we're using to actually open the seal, then we can always replace those too. Because none of these little tiny pieces are going to be serialized for the majority of these seals. The other thing we're going to talk about are, they're essentially the same thing. They're just little tiny versions of plunger seals. And if you remember our power company example, these are essentially what they use on the vast majority of little power meters. Just this little tiny piece of plastic that you could easily rip open with your hands. Usually a serial number or a identifier for whatever company. I don't know in Las Vegas who handles water and power, but probably whatever their initials are on that. And it's essentially the same thing, no cap, but now we have, on most of these, we have access to both ends of the little holes. So you can imagine all the ways we can shim or counterfeit this little tiny seal. And if you notice, the one on the left does not have a serial number. Now, it probably should, but think if we have a blank, we could always determine what the method of printing is, print our own serial number on there, and just replace it, as long as we have color and serial number right. There's also what are called padlock seals, and they resemble padlocks. Now, the one on the left is a little bit better. It's essentially just a spring-loaded detainer, so when you put the shackle in, it snaps into place, and you can't take it back. So we could always drill out and replace the shackle on the one on the left. The one on the right is similar. You see it has this little flag here where a serial number should also be on the shackle. This one has no serial number on the body, but let's assume it could. So the insides look like that. It's just this little brass clip that springs out, and when you try and pull it out, it doesn't work. So we could take a high-tech lockpick, and we could just push those out of the way. But what I thought was a really funny attack was you could take a second clip, and you have just enough room. Probably better if you filed one down to take both out. And then you take your original, and you just snap it back into place. Here, you want to try? Well, I'll give you both. So yeah, pretty easy. And this seal that just got handed out is used primarily in hospitals to seal up drugs and dangerous chemicals and all sorts of other fun stuff that they have in hospitals for all the biohazard boxes that we steal on a regular basis and such. Oh, what's that? It's cheap. It's very cheap. I'm sure that's one of the least expensive seals you can buy, but it doesn't really do a job. You could probably buy a padlock for $1 more. That would be better. So there's another type of padlock seal, which is, depending on the design, it's hard to say what seal is better than others because it's very dependent on the company that makes it and, the actual design that they use and the procedures they use to distribute it and, the variety of colors and other kind of crap that they do. But these are just little one-way locks as well, and they just clip into the little plastic body. They have all metal versions, but the vast majority in use are plastic. And these are also used by a lot of power and gas companies for the meters. And again, the body's serialized. The inside is just these little teeth. So once you clamp it down, you're not supposed to be able to pull back up. And those little legs that force into the plastic are actually pretty strong and have a lot of force on them, so they dig in quite well. So you might be thinking, well, can't we just stick a lockpick in there and bend them out? It's actually surprisingly difficult. So what our Tamper team came up with for a cool defeat, it's maybe not altogether practical in the field, but we do electrolysis on it and dissolve the plastic clip. Now, I think, honestly, you could do this in the field. It takes about a half hour to fully dissolve both sides. And the great thing is, you don't need to do this while it's actually sealed on something. You clip the little ring, and then you put it in your solution, and then you wait until you get all this. Now, you do need a replacement clip. So that's why we have a big box of replacement clips from all the different types of padlock seals we found. And I don't think we found any seals that actually resist this, of this type, except for the all-metal ones, because obviously the all-metal ones would go away completely. But when you're done, you get that, and then you can just pop a new clip in. And it doesn't damage the plastic, doesn't discolor the ink. Previously, we were using muriatic acid and water for, well, I guess that just makes it more or less muriatic. It took about 2 hours, but we realized we didn't need the electrolyte from the muriatic acid, and now we're just using salt water. So it's a lot safer, and we don't have to put big signs up at the contest that say, stay the fuck away from this cup. Not a joke, not a joke. We talked about it just briefly earlier, metal cable seals, and it's essentially just this body, and your metal cable strand goes through, and then it gets locked in place. Can't pull it out. So what it is there's this little gear, and when you first put the end of the cable in, it pushes the gear into this hole, and then there's a spring that pushes up into the cable, and that's what makes it so you can't pull out. Ha ha ha. But so let's talk about, we talked about how there's different flaws in the different parts of the Tamper process, or I'm retarded. How there's flaws in design and installation, and what if you have access to it before it's installed. So does this seal look sealed? right? Looks good? Well, oh, that's hot, right? So what's in here is just a little shim piece, just a little piece of metal that holds that piece down. So if the person installing it doesn't check that it's actually sealed, if they just pull it tight because you think, well, that looks fine, then they may not notice. So think of all these little attacks. And with the plunger seals, what you could do is, say you have access to them before they're installed, you can cut off some of those legs so that only one leg actually holds the plunger back. And then think of how much easier it would be to shim if you only have to remove one leg from the plunger. And the same is true here. What we can also do is use another high-tech piece of metal, and we can physically block the little gear from touching the cable. And so we just take our shim, see which end's thinner. Just take our shim, you place it in, and with this one, it's kind of shitty, to be honest, because it's one of the small ones and it's not really used for anything important. And usually you have to tighten with the cable. So you're dragging it through with the cable, and then it eventually blocks. But with this one, you can just kind of push it through because there's enough tolerance between the wall and the cable. So I'm tightening it now, make sure it goes in. And then I'm going to hold the shim in place, pull our cable out. I like that it takes one person clapping to motivate the rest of you. So does anybody want to try this? Don't get it stuck for the other 90 rows. But I'll pass this around. You have the shim. So just get it in there and then hold it with the cable. Push it through.
Shim is sharp, right?
Yeah, well, it's small. If you cut yourself, you're retarded, so. But to be fair, I just got done with a 2-day black hat class, Monday, Tuesday, on tampering stuff, and we went through the whole box of Band-Aids, 3 or 4 of which I'm proud to say were my own. So don't feel bad if you cut yourself, but we will point and laugh at you. Some other defeats for these, because you consider it's just a little spring-loaded gear, some of them are ferrous. So you could, there's a bullshit discussion with John about whether or not magnets pull or push. I'm actually not very good at science. I flunked physics. So the idea is that you pull away the little gear, and then the cable's free, in the same sense that if you put the shim through, there's a barrier. But you could do this with magnets, and one of the teams last year at the DEF CON contest did this. Now, you need a bigger magnet for the bigger seals. That's one of the smallest ones that they make, but it's the same idea. Now, this one's actually a very cool seal, and this is the first, well, technically, the higher level cable seals are approved by Customs and Border Patrol, and an agreement called CTPAT, which means Transportation Protection and Anti-Terrorism. And that's what Customs uses to ensure cargo reliability and tamper evidence and so on and so forth. So the big cable seals are similar. This is the second one that they approve. And they only approve 3 mechanical seals, 3 types of mechanical seal, about 5 models in total between the 3. So I believe it's 2 cable seals, 2 bolt seals, and this metal ball seal. And so what it is inside there's these little rings. So on the top is it before we close it. And normally there's a ball over it, but you get the inside view. And so there's these little metal rings, and they are sheared. They don't go all the way through in the top. They clip onto the metal, and they just hold themselves there by the force of the ring pushing into the metal. Now when you push the cable through, it physically moves those rings, and they snap through the second hole. And then they have room to rotate and spin, and you can't pull your strap back out. So it's a very, very simple but ingenious design. And every company I can find that sells these represent them as tamper-proof in big red big red letters. Let me get some more water. So let's think about how can we defeat this. It's tamper-proof, which may deter us. But can we pick it? Can we rotate those rings back and spread them to get the strap through? Probably, but it's going to be very difficult. If it was one ring, it might be a bit easier. But the fact that there's 2 or more usually, typically 2, makes it a bit more difficult. And it's possible, but you'll probably scrape up all the metal, sitting there jiggling rings back and forth and spinning them, which will leave evidence of tampering. Now, whether or not you can repair that scrapes and removal of paint and so on and so forth is another story, and it's another way of attacking it. But let's consider picking to be too difficult. Can we shear and repair the strap? So can we cut it open and then somehow repair it? Again, it has to pass the tug test, so that may or may not be too difficult. Can we counterfeit it? Can we change the serial number? Can we replicate this? Obviously, if you're an intelligence agency or a giant manufacturing company, some of these might be a little easier than others. But all of the attacks we're going to talk today are very low tech. And there's a group called the Vulnerability Assessment Team at Argonne, and they did a big study on a couple hundred seals and found that it doesn't really matter whether or not you spend more money on your seals, because the cost of defeat is almost always extremely low. And when you spend more money, you don't necessarily prevent tampering for longer or make it more difficult. So we could change the serial number theoretically, but it's very difficult, requires a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of preparation. We could also replace parts. What else? Anybody? Okay. Well, what we thought of was pretty funny, was that if we look back at our seal, so what's the only thing that's not unique about this? The ball. So can we remake a ball? Now, remaking a ball from scratch is pretty hard. But what if you take halves of other balls and you build an awesome recrimping die? So essentially what you do, you find your target seal. You cut your ball off with a Dremel, being careful not to nick the strap anywhere. You undo the rings to open it and take it off, whatever it is. Then you put it flat. You put half your ball on. You put your rings back on. You put your other half on, because that's how I assume they make it at the factory. And then you recrimp it with just this little hand tool. And it's just these two little pieces of metal that you can hit with a hammer very softly. And then you get tampered seals. So can you tell which ones in that photo are tampered? 1, 2. How many think all 3 of them were tampered? That man voted twice. How many of you think 2 of them have been tampered? How many of you think 1 of them has been tampered? How many of you are gullible enough to think 0 of them have been tampered? Well, the answer is 2 out of those 3 have been tampered. Can you tell which ones? Now, obviously, this is a bit flawed, just looking at a photo with a single view of the seals. What's that?
Yeah, 2 on the left.
How?
Small scrapes, but
Well, but the other one has scrapes. What about the scrapes here? Linear scrapes. That man must be a forensic expert. Well, I'm not going to tell you. The next seal we're going to talk about are called bolt seals, and they're the 3rd seal approved by Customs and Border Patrol. And so bolt seals, again, are just these one-way locks. They snap into place. So here's a cutaway view. And what it is usually just a little clip or a little ring. And when you force your big piece into the body, then it just snaps into place and makes it so you can't pull it out. And so tampering with these can be very difficult. Again, let's look at our examples. So you can see there's a wide variety of different bolt seals available. There's some that are all plastic. There's one here that has a double serial number. There's one here that has just a metal bolt and a single serial number, and so on and so forth. So what can we do? Well, first thing we can do, and this works a bit better on all metal seals, or at least seals with an only metal bolt, is you just shear the bolt at one of the bases, and then you can add a screw and re-screw it back in and make it feel right. Because again, they're not going to notice these things just looking at it from a foot away. They'd have to actually tug on it, and you'll probably pass a tug test if you do this properly. And then to see this little mark, they'd have to look at it very closely. So we consider this a level 1 or a level 2 defeat, because it's not perfect, but it'll probably fool most people. And if you look at one of these seals that we had, I guess this is a better photo. You see on the left, where I'm pointing again at my screen, if you see over here, it has these little stumps, and that's to try and prevent you from cutting it off on this edge. And on this side, it has a bit of a slope, so it's supposed to be more easy to detect. But again, your tamper-evident devices are only as good as your inspector. The other thing we could do is drill and repair or replace the bolt. Think about the all-metal bolts, a bit easier to replace, and a bit easier to resurface and reserialize if we have to go through that much trouble. All plastic makes it a bit more difficult. The all plastic ones are more common for some of the higher security stuff because they're also corrosion resistant because they got the buffer of plastic around all the metal. So let's talk about more consumer level stuff. These are called crimps and wraps. So we have some similar mechanical seals that are crimped. And so this one on the left, you can see it just has a big flag hanging out, and there's a special crimping tool that just rolls the flag around whatever wire you're trying to seal. And on the right, you can see an example of it over a little box hasp. This is a more sophisticated version, which is used on a lot of gas companies use this on their meters. And it's just a copper or steel, whatever type of wire, threaded through a little piece of lead, and then they crimp it. And so it squishes itself and physically restricts the wire from moving. So we could defeat these too. These are usually easy to counterfeit. If you look at our previous example, you see it has some markings, but that's probably on every single one that they sell. So it's easy to replace. All you need is the $40 or $50 crimping tool to redo the crimp. And the same goes for most of these. Now, there's obviously more sophisticated ones. There's plastic versions of this. But they're all the same idea, that you squish them, and then it's hard to get the wire out. And then whether or not the actual security they offer is up for debate. So the one nice thing is that if you're very, very thorough about your forensic examination of these, the way the metal deforms and the actual tool pattern of the crimper that you're using is probably easy to identify. So if you look at this one, on the bottom here, you can see how it folds and distorts the metal. You can take a photo of this, and then if you're diligent enough, you can inspect it very thoroughly at its destination to determine if it's the same seal or if it's been counterfeited. So there's a photo of just one of the seal crimping tools, just a simple hand tool. There's also these seals called self-crimping seals. And what it is you thread, again, a wire through the back of it, and then you just snap it closed, and you can do it with your fingers. Unfortunately, all the ones I found for these suck really bad, and you could just take a lockpick and bend all the little pieces that are supposed to hold it together out, and then open it up, and then re-snap it, and so on and so forth. So plastic wraps are something you're all familiar with. Plastic wraps are funny because they're extremely common, and they vary quite a bit. Some companies put them on just because, why not? Some are forced to, like drug and pharmaceutical companies. But the real question is, what are your goals? If it's a bottle of pills, what's your goal? Is your goal to open it completely and have full access to the pills? Is your goal just to put a doping agent, on some of the pills so that when somebody eats it, they'll drop dead? There's a lot of different things that don't really line up. So yes, it does restrict movement of the cap, but does that matter? Would somebody notice a hole somewhere else? And so on and so forth. So of course, these can be defeated also. Some of them you could just physically kind of wiggle and get them off if they don't use a big enough undercut for the wrap itself. Some you could just cut just enough to take it off and then repair it with either heat or glue. A lot of these aren't serialized, so you could just always replace them with a counterfeit version. And all the same attacks. Use your brain. Don't think of this talk as, well, datagram said this is the best way to attack a seal, or datagram thinks this, or datagram can't do this one perfect. It doesn't matter, because again, it's super dependent on the actual person inspecting it. So obviously, when I try and think up defeats, I think up ones that the more forensic inspectors would miss. But it's not like lockpicking, where it's a binary thing. Is the lock open or closed? Tamper is much more vague than that because of the human element. So we're going to talk about adhesives now. And adhesives are pretty cool. There's no standards available in the US for the strength of an adhesive, so it's hard to tell one from the other. And they have very mixed effectiveness. They're misunderstood. Think of all the combinations of things you need to think about to determine if the adhesive is right for what you want. You need to think about what you're going to put it on. You need to think about the backing of the adhesive, the actual plastic part of it, the adhesive it uses, how the adhesive works with whatever you're putting on. You need to think about how long does the adhesive have to cure before it starts on its trip to wherever it's going, because that makes a huge difference. Think of if you just glue something and you wait 5 seconds to pull your hand away. It's probably going to break. Well, the same is true of tape to a smaller degree. If you don't give tape enough time to cure, then it's not going to adhere as strongly, and it's going to be less resistant to a number of attacks. So the first thing you could do is just try and shim it off. Use like a Coke can, just try and get under it and shear the adhesive. And then you break it off, and there'll be some adhesive left on, we'll say a box for all these examples, and then some left on the tape. And you can just put it back when you're done. And you may or not be able to do this without it looking weird. You could also think of water or steam. Is the adhesive water soluble? Can we just remove it and then reapply the adhesive? Can we steam it off if it's one of those paper tapes? can we use solvents to either remove the adhesive or create a barrier between it and the substrate? Can we use temperature, hot or cold? And can we always counterfeit it? So that's a good question, is can we counterfeit it? It's almost always the first question, because counterfeiting is usually the easiest to defeat if you have the resources for it. So many adhesives, despite saying tamper evident, I gotta stop laughing because I keep fucking it up. Many adhesives offer zero security, and they're essentially glorified stickers, in the same way that some of the others were glorified zip ties. So this tape in the photo, not very tamper evident. The idea is that those lines, that if you cut them, it's really hard to realign them. But what if you don't cut them? Then it's really easy to take off. So again, we ask ourselves some questions. Is it serializes? What's it applied to? What is the material? What type of residue does it leave behind? Because some tamper tapes will leave behind a big void or open message. And how much do you really need to remove? Because that cuts down on your time to tamper. If I only need to remove half of it to open something, then it's a lot faster than if I need to do the entire thing. And it usually requires less resources. So there's technically three types of residues. There's what's called full residue. I'll just go through it here. There's full residue, which leaves residue along the entire width of the tape. And then there's partial residue, which just leaves a bit. So some might have a transparent full residue. You can see it because the contrast is kind of screwy. But if you look right here, you'll see there's a line. And then up here, there's another line. But this one just has the letters saying, this has been opened or whatever. There's also no residue tapes, which are usually just very small adhesives. And when you pull them off, it leaves nothing on the surface, but it makes the letters void or whatever appear on the actual tape itself, and usually ruins the adhesive so that you can't re-adhere it to something. So let's talk about solvents. Solvents are probably my favorite attack because they have the most cloak and dagger appeal to me. And I get huge boners for CIA stuff. I'll try and control myself, though. So here's a photo of me removing just EFF tape, the EFF disclaimer tape that says, we do this and that and that. And where I'm just removing it with some basic stuff. And all the stuff that we're talking about, Coke cans, I'm sure you can acquire, syringes, needles, solvents, all this stuff is very easy to acquire. It's just hardware stuff, hardware store stuff, drug stores, and arts and crafts stores, funnily enough. So let's talk about what common solvents are. Acetone is very good. Isopropyl alcohol. Literally, we can walk down the nail polish remover aisle in the market and pick all sorts of awesome solvents that are great for tamper. Carbon tetrachloride was used heavily by intelligence agencies, but we can't use it because we're afraid to die. But apparently, it's awesome at removing tape, so something to think about. I think it might be illegal in this state. I'm not sure. In a lot of states, it's not legal anymore. There's also MEK, methyl ethyl ketone. The list really just goes on. It's a 10-year chemistry course to think of all this stuff. There's also a cool fluid called stamp lift fluid, which stamp collectors use. They don't want to have to use an X-Acto knife and cut out their stamp from the envelope to make it look nice. So they put it on the back of the envelope, and then that releases the stamp. Now, a lot of old stamps will use the same adhesive as most envelopes. So it also works to put it on top of the envelope flap, and it soaks through and dissolves the adhesive, or makes it weak enough that you could lift it. And again, there's a huge number of chemicals that you could use. Most are available at the hardware store or the drug store. So let's talk about how do we inspect adhesives. Because mechanical seals, we do the tug test. With adhesives, we want to look at them. And so we want to find all these different things. We want to find any cuts or tears or wrinkles. We want to find distortion or smearing if there's words printed on it or a pattern. And then any changes that we can. Again, this all depends on how far you're willing to go to inspect these when they get to their destination, and how far you're willing to prepare for that before they leave their destination. So some things we can look at. Incorrect solvent use will obviously be very messy, especially for some of the higher grade tamper tapes. Essentially just dissolves, and then unless you can counterfeit that tape, it can be very difficult to fix. And then if you look at the box here, we also have all this blue ink bleeding into the box, so you'd need to figure out how to remove that as well. And here's a closer version after it's set for a little longer. You can see it just slowly dissolving all the tape and the backing. Heat is good, but very easy to screw up on. If you put too much heat, plastic will usually wrinkle and melt, and so on and so forth. One other thing that a lot of people don't look for is the actual gloss. If you kind of tilt it right in the light, you can see the gloss of the adhesive. Most are glossy, some aren't. And then determine, is that normal? Does that look right? Because some solvents will actually affect that. They'll also affect the adhesive strength of the adhesive. So a true tamper test would be not to just cut the box open, but to try and peel up the adhesive. If it's supposed to leave a residue, you have to verify that it's leaving the correct residue. Because think of if somebody just took, our blue tape and just put a blue tape and then painted it blue or whatever they did to fix it. When you peel that up, if it doesn't react the same way as, a real one would, then that's evidence of tampering. And then again, heat will ruin a lot of stuff. This is an acetate-based evidence bag security label, and heat makes it bubble and go all crazy. And you can see even the letters are all warped up here. We talked about how some solvents might remove the adhesive. A lot just lift it. A lot create a buffer between whatever you're applying it to and the tape and allow you to just pull it off. And then once they dry out a bit, you could just re-stick it as if it was a normal tape. If you have to add glue, it could be very messy. And you can see here around the edges, there's some glue. And because there's glue, a lot of little hair and fiber got stuck around the edges. If you have to use a spray adhesive, you need to consider that an aerosol can has propellant, and that will be on whatever you spray. So here's a photo of spray adhesive being reapplied to a tape, and that's obviously not normal for the, I don't know about you, but the tape I buy, I don't need to sit there with the can. So what else? We talked about some basic mechanicals. We talked about adhesive seals. There's obviously a lot more. In the history section, we went over a few. There's electronics, are one of the big ones. But it's hard to give a talk on those because they're so different from traditional tamper seals. There's plenty more. Think of envelopes. Think of wax seals, the clay seals we talked about earlier. Plenty more seals if you're somehow interested in this and crazy like I am. Thanks, Dark Tangent, by the way, for creating this. And then there's lots of practice. Lots of defeats are not easy. Some of the stuff I showed is pretty simple once you get the hang of it, but some require many hours, weeks, even months of practice to do properly. Because again, as people who just like to hack and do stuff, you wouldn't hack a machine and leave a big sign saying it's been hacked. You want to leave as little evidence as possible. So you go deeper and deeper into this. You get better and better at it, and less people will be able to inspect it and determine if tampering has occurred. So on that note, we can think, how do we improve our defeats to leave less evidence, to require us to do less repairs or replacements of parts and so on? And on the flip side, how do we improve all of our policies for installing and inspecting and disposing of seals to make this process easier for both the inspectors and all the people that have to use and be around these seals? And those questions are very dependent on your application. I think one thing that's difficult, because, in my humble opinion, talks like this haven't been given very much, that it's very hard to determine what's a good seal and what's not. Like, all the ones I passed out, say, oh, okay, it locks. But unless you actually go through all the trouble of investigating all these technologies and trying all these different things, you don't really know what that offers you, other than if somebody pulls it off, it's really obvious. So think of all these things. And think, a lot of you use tamper seals in various forms, either mechanical seals. Most of us probably use adhesive seals for our hardware products and so on. How do you integrate that knowledge into your business? You need to think as much as you can about this kind of stuff, because it does make a difference. And I give a lot of lockpicking and physical security talks because we focus heavily on digital security here. But the physical security is just as important. And if you think we're using tamper seals, not just for pill bottles, but also to prevent other countries from violating treaties or, make sure that our nuclear material isn't tampered with from, point A to point B, that these things do matter as much as our SCADA systems or our beloved firewalls or our browsers and so on and so forth. So just think about all those things. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. Please let me know if you have any questions. I think we have a bit of time. I actually don't know. Yes, sir.
In the competitions that you've done, what's given you the most trouble?
The question is, in the competitions I've done, what's given me the most trouble? Maybe plastic evidence bags, just because those are frangible by nature.
Announcing tamperevidentwiki.com. It's a community site for us all to talk about tamper stuff.
Okay. DT just informed me that as soon as DEF CON starts, a site called tamperevidentwiki.com will be available I think the contest will be using that to store all of our defeats and information about the seals. So if you want more information, go there as soon as DEF CON starts.